Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Jaron Lanier, who is a computer scientist, a composer, a visual artist, and an author. Jaron, welcome back to the campus.
Glad to be here.
Now, there's an irony here, because in this work you are helping to create devices, machines, whatever, that have very close to human qualities. But as a philosopher, which you are, is another hat that you wear, you've been very critical and even put out what you called a half manifesto against ideas that suggest that the work in technology could create a future paradise in essence, which robots are human and humans are subsidiary to robots.
Well, in my view, technology and culture co-create each other, and I think any technologist has responsibility to be culturally literate and to be an active and compassionate cultural player. Now, I have a very strong line of disagreement with many of my colleagues about the cultural context and meaning for a lot of the work we're doing in digital technology. So I don't believe that presents a conflict, because I really have a fundamental trust in people at large that they'll see through the nonsense and that this will work out okay in the long term. So what I do is I make the technology that I think is worthwhile, and then I also try to be a cultural player. So a lot of my colleagues are very technology-centered, and they do have this notion that just making better technology in itself is a reason for life, and that the technology is more important than people, essentially, and that ultimately some sort of perfected computer will be more intelligent than people and will inherit reality, and people will have been just a side effect of the creation of this perfection. I find that to be a dismal and abhorrent philosophy. I absolutely don't support it, and I think there are a multitude of things wrong with it, and so I try to present an alternate one in which we work together towards a future of improved connection between people, of enhanced creativity, of enhanced expressiveness, as opposed to just the power of the machine. And so I try to work towards a human-centered future. But anyway, this is an ongoing debate.
Let's look a little at the assumption of the people on the other side, because they, and I'm going to give a rough synopsis here, and I'm not a technologist, but in other words, they have, their notions are built on, it seems, the Darwinian ideas about a future in which Moore's law applies, and you're essentially arguing, as I understand it, that that their assumptions relate to the hardware issue. You know, where clearly in very short periods of time we're exponentially increasing the power of computers, but what they're ignoring is what you call the software problem. Would you explain that? Because I think it's a fascinating insight which would help our audience understand this debate.
Sure. Well, we should first explain Moore's law. So Moore's law is an existential principle of Silicon Valley, and it's that silicon chips keep on getting roughly twice as good and half the price every year and a half, more or less. This is something that's been going on since the origin of microelectronics, and it is what drives the industry. It means that computers get better and more types of gadgets are enabled over time. Now, contrary to Moore's law, we have software which is required to make computers do anything. And the interesting thing about software is if you write larger and larger programs to take advantage of these computers, they tend to have more and more bugs and difficulties. And if you believe that the important thing about computers is how much raw power there is, then you see this curve of them getting better and better, and then at some point maybe a couple decades from now, it kind of zooms into near infinitely vertical ascent, which is what is called the singularity, when computers become so much better so quickly that humans can no longer comprehend their splendor. But if you look at the problems related to software, which is sort of the mirror image, around the same time you have software descending into an absolutely impassable morass in which no bigger program can ever be written. So between these two trends is the truth, which is characteristic of reality, in which you have conflicting trends and chaos, and you have just as in evolution you don't have the smooth motion of evolution, you have punctuated equilibria. The same thing with this. You have a very complex pattern of progress, and of course technologists would prefer to only see the good news. Who wouldn't? And so they tend to believe that they're riding this chariot to heaven on this kind of this inevitably improving computer that will become transcendent. I think it's nonsense. I really do. But there are people who believe it. In fact, I would say it's the dominant school of thought in the academic computer science world now, which I think is a shame.
And what in your background leads you to be such a humanist in the context of your success as a technologist?
That's an interesting question. It might be that I flunked out of art school when I was 17, so that I never really got back on the academic track. I can imagine, had I not done that, I would have earned my PhD, and I would have been, instead of just being a kid in Marvin Minsky's basement, who's a prominent proponent of these types of ideas based at MIT, and kind of being mentored by him informally, I would have actually had him as an advisor and wouldn't have been able to be such a thorn in his side. I adore him, but I just disagree with him. And similarly for other figures, I think maybe it made me more independent. I'm not sure about that. I know from a very young age, when I first was around this body of thought at 16 or 17, I immediately felt that it was wrong. It bothered me immensely on many levels. It seemed as though there was it created an absurdity where we were all trying to build this machine for its own sake, but the only measure of that machine was us, so we ended up doing nothing. We ended up just launching one absurdity on top of another, and I felt it was a completely ungrounded program.
Now, this group of technologists who embrace these ideas, you coined the term cybernetic totalists, basically.
Right.
Now, interestingly enough, for somebody who doesn't study this, in reading some of your writing, you were at some point talking about communism, and you said communism did not acknowledge the existence of human experience beyond the scope of its own ideas, and then you go on to suggest that there was a vanity about it. So this is parallel to what you're observing among your adversaries in the battle of ideas, right?
Right. Well, I mean, this is commonplace to all totalisms. All absolutists are vain. And that's essentially what the game is. And I'm important. I'm the master of reality. I am. My ideas are of such importance that they transcend even death. I mean, this is the oldest game in the book, and as long as the people who believe that are not too powerful, it can be charming. However, the nature of the power of technologists is a little different from previous forms of power. If some of these figures, like a Marvin Minsky or a Ray Kurzweil or any of a number of other ones, are unlikely to run for political office. They're unlikely to become a figure like Oprah, who's explicitly a cultural leader. But what they do is they create the tools that all of us organize our lives through, like our computers and our various gadgets. And those actually contain a structure that embed their ideas. And through that indirect route, they actually have enormous influence. And they also have enormous influence in the academy. And I believe they've had an influence in everything from medicine to economics that in some cases has been helpful, but also in some cases has been confusing.
Now, you in your philosophical writings, if and I will call them that, you were very sensitive to power, to issues of justice and equity. And in one piece that I read on infrastructure that you wrote, you talk about that architecture is politics, which is the idea that you just conveyed, namely that you let me bring up this point that you made earlier, that the legacy in software sets us down a road which we can't retreat from. You use the example of files, which at one time was a very good idea, but as it became embedded in the traditions, has created something that we have to work around.
Well, traditionally, the way one person influences another person is through talk. You meet in the agora and you debate and you speak, or you write books. The way you can influence people in the computer age is different. So, for instance, if the architecture of the internet is designed in such a way that a government agency has windows onto what everybody's saying, but they do not have windows onto each other, that embeds a certain kind of power structure that isn't just an interpretive one as it is with rules handed down or policy directives from a Politburo, but it becomes actually embedded in the way people can connect. It becomes actually more mandatory. And thus far, I think we've been pretty lucky with what's been laid down, but it's crucially important that the things that are laid down are well thought out. And I think in terms of liberties, we're actually doing fairly well, although there are perils. What concerns me more is the sort of new humanistic concern of the definition of the human within the context of the information system. So an example I talk about a lot is in Microsoft Word, which is the almost universal means that people use to write. What could be more important than that? There's an artificial intelligence design component in which the program tries to foresee what you want to do, and it corrects your spelling and capitalization and such things. But a great example of perhaps where it fails badly is if it believes that you are starting an indented list, it'll throw you into this mode that you can never get out of, and you just essentially have to go along with it. So you have this very strange thing where you can either bend over backwards to kind of learn what cues it's looking for so that you can create the illusion that it's smart, that it knows you, or you can capitulate and do what it wants you to. But the point is that you're forced to accept the computer sort of as a creative partner and to delegate to yourself a computer-like role instead of a human role. And that process and the fact that people are willing to accept it, in this case it's not a big deal, it's a very minor point, but as a precedent of what might come, it's deeply disturbing to me. And so I feel it's very, very important to point out this notion of computer-human equivalence and to try to oppose it at every turn.
And so the real danger here is that this effort might lead to an effort to make people like computers, which has the consequences that you're talking about.
Well, from the point of view of the people doing it, they don't believe that. They believe they're trying to make computers like people, but the problem is that ultimately there's no way. I mean, it's a matter of perspective. The two activities are absolutely equivalent. You can't distinguish them, and that's the problem.
Is this why, is this kind of thinking behind your very great concern about access and the inequalities that will be created? And what is access about when you're talking about access to the world of all of this technology?
Well, so here's the dilemma we face. On the one hand, there is truth to the neoconservative economists' claim that the rising tide raises all boats, and it's true that there is a noticeable decrease in absolute poverty and so forth. On the other hand, it's also true that if you have an exponential increase in the wealth of those at the top of the economic spectrum, and that exponent is steeper than those at the bottom, the gap between them widens. And so if you look at this widening thing, even if the bottom is raising somewhat, the gap is widening at an even larger rate. And so you start to have a separation of humanity. And here we go back to another one of the early pieces of speculative fiction from over a century ago, H.G. Wells' Time Machine, in which he foresaw the human species breaking in two over this very issue. And I think his concern was absolutely valid. I mean, I think with this widening gap taking place at the same time that we have an enormous expansion of medical technology and so forth, I'm profoundly concerned essentially that the species could break into two, with one part having designer genes and living longer and this and that. And that this question of information access is not life or death right now, but it's the precedent question that'll set the terms of what medicine and health are like, say, 20 or 30 years from now.
You say in one of your writings, your goal is to find the mysteriousness in each other. And we can do that if we treat the computer as conduits between imaginations rather than as things that are real in their own right. And then new art will be born.
Yeah. I believe that.
Yeah.
I'm a complete idealist.
And we're going to talk about your music in a moment. But one other point that emerged in your philosophical writings is this notion of a circle of empathy. In fact, I was just on the Huffington blog, and that was a point that you made, you touched on, I think, in your most recent blog. The more we imagine ourselves becoming machines, the more we risk losing our humanity. And you talk about defining a circle of empathy, which helps us in a way. It seems to be a guide for understanding our humanness. And the people you're arguing with, the technologists, in a way, want to put the computer inside that circle of it. Talk a little about that. Because
now, by the way, so far as I know, I've been using the term and the idea of the circle of empathy for a longer period of time, but it's also used in exactly the same way by the animal rights activist philosopher from Princeton, Peter Singer. I don't know which of us has priority on it, but at any rate, he uses it in the same way. And the question is, if you draw a circle around yourself and you say, are things within this circle you empathize with, things outside you don't. What's in the circle? Is a fetus in the circle so that you would prohibit abortion? Is an animal in the circle? Is a computer in the circle? And this is a great deal of moral struggle really comes down to what belongs in the circle. And there's a pragmatic sensibility to this because you can't extend the circle to infinity or you become incompetent. This is the tragedy of life. This is the tragedy that every idealistic kid has to face. And so, the problem with putting a computer in the circle is that in empathizing with it, you make yourself like it. And rather than looking into the computer, which no matter how big the computer is, it's not as big as the wilds of reality. I mean, reality is this mysterious sea that you make contact with tentatively as either an artist or a scientist. You're touching this mystery. If you're looking into the computer, you're looking into a reduced mystery that's a maze of ideas that have been represented. But reality itself is not represented. It's larger. And so you confine yourself to this smaller thing. And the way out of that is, instead of believing in this little smaller world as having something of value, you treat it as a conduit where it's a filter between people that allows people to see and explore each other in new ways, and then you rediscover the fundamental mysteriousness of reality within that other person on the other side. And so that is the way out. That's the way to have meaning and the benefits of digital technology at the same time.